probabilistic beliefs or degrees in belief. And in that case, well, I'm not sure whether it's crazy for the collective
You're absolutely right. Let me just answer by way of concession. The former result that Christian and I proved in 2002 and a lot of the other results, they're only on creedal states, if you like, which come in a on-off form, like judgments. Like the idea with the belief as you take it is what you might call a credence, as in there are degrees of credence. And the content of credences are always non-probabilistic, like P, Q, R, or whatever, and then you can have degrees of such credence. We are doing it simply with judgments, which you either judge something to be the case, or you don't judge it to be the case, or you judge it not to be the case. And the content may be, of course, with this notion, may be probabilistic. You may judge it to be the case that probably so-and-so. This is a half judging it to be the case that so-and-so, or judging it with some degree of confidence to be the case that so-and-so. Now, this proof entirely works with the notion of judgment. Not only that, it's more restricted than that, because it also works with the notion of judgment where the content is not probabilistic, right? As you said, because, again, you're going to get the problem with probability contents, that you won't get the same rules of logic governing them as with non-probabilistic contents. That's certainly an idealization and a simplification. Okay, so what to say about it? Well, one is that, and again, Peter and Blodek probably know more about this than I do, and maybe other people in the audience. The corresponding results aren't there as yet, though there are some results that are relevant in past literatures, and people I know actively claim to be on the track of other results currently, which would parallel the results I've talked about and would involve probabilistic credences rather than judgments. And really I can't speak to that because I'm so relatively an expert on it. But the other thing to say, I think, is maybe more relevant to our purposes, which is that when it comes to group agents forming, right? Because at least as I think of group agents, now there may be other logically possible ways in which they form, but the way I think of them forming on the basis of joint intention, as I said at the very beginning, that each of us intends that we together shall pursue certain ends, each of us intends that each of us will do his or her part because of believing others will do their part, and this is a matter of common belief amongst us as a whole. On that way of constructing either joint ends or joint judgments, as in each of us intends that we as a group and our representatives shall take it to be the case that P, right? Each of us intends to do his part in making the case that we shall take it to be the case that P of this matter of common knowledge. On that way of, as it were, talking up group attitudes, then you will go with judgments rather than credences, okay? At least most closely. And now actually think about, the way groups of this kind work. They tend to work in terms of forming judgments of this kind. Of course, they may often put in probabilistic content, that's true. But the notion of judgment fits rather than the notion of credence with this particular way of constructing group agents, which I take to be, the most obvious dominant way. I suspect there are other people with things to say on this.
But if I sort of may continue on Magnus, I guess this is what Magnus thought was, no, think of this, it's not credences, right? It's judgments.
Yeah.
But think of judgments or acceptances of certain standpoints as determined by your credences. So, supposing that your probability for a proposition is above a certain threshold, then you say yes. If your probability for the negation is above a certain threshold, then you say no, but you have also a possibility of saying neither if the credences are in a certain interval.
Yeah.
And then, of course, as an individual, you can be in exactly this situation that you say yes to P, yes to Q, yes to R, but you say no to the conjunction because its probability is too low to pass it's sufficiently high, the probability of negation to say no, right? And then if you think of collective, right? And if you think of, suppose that there's a large number of people who say yes to a certain issue, and there's small minority who say no. This can be seen as a collective having a very high credence for that proposition. The credence that passes a threshold, so the collective say yes to that, right? And this is a way of looking at majority vote, right? And then, it's not such strange that you can have a collective saying yes to P, yes to Q, yes to R, but no to the conjunction, right? There's no irrationality if you think of judgments as acceptances based on credence, right?
Very interesting suggestions. Let me reject them or resist them. Although I'm not sure how much I'm invested in this, but I want to say I can still say, even where I can see in various ways. But well, here's one problem I have with Dave. You say an individual may, under the threshold conception of judgment, judge the P, judge the Q, but not judge the P and Q, right? Probabilistic perfect sense. I would say, though, that that itself is an argument against the threshold conception of making judgments. Because actually, if someone comes to you and says, I judge the P, I judge the Q, but P and Q, no. You'd say to them, oh, wait a minute, when you said you judge the P, you really mean you judge the P is maybe 80% probable, right? Because after all, you can't say P, but not P and Q. And surely you're inviting the person to backtrack a bit. And I think I predict that's how most of us would backtrack and say, yeah, well, okay, what I meant is I didn't really mean P, I meant 80% probable that P, I meant 50% probable that, 60% probable that Q, and of course I don't think that P and Q, because that's only 48% probable, assuming they're independent. 6 by 8 is 48, right? Okay, so it's less than 50. So they'll self-correct. But that itself is a way of suggesting that the theory of judgment, according to which I judge the P whenever my degree of credence of the P is higher than, take any limit you like, is a questionable theory about judgment. And there'll be tigers in those mountains, as we know, sharks in those waters. It's difficult territory. As I say, you two know it much better than I do. Now, on the other question, though, about we could interpret a group when it says, for example, P, Q, R, but not P and Q and R, we could interpret it as having just a degree of belief in P and Q and R, in each of P, Q, R, that would not in P and Q and R, but sufficiently low not to. The trouble with that suggestion is that often where a group will go is going to be path dependent. So depending on which issues they take a judgment on first, right, they'll say, okay, well, we've got to judge this class, because previously we've announced that we judged it, we put our colours to that mask. We've got to make this judgment, we're going to look silly or whatever. Now, if it's path dependent, it's just have they taken other judgments earlier before this one. If there is any degree of path dependence, that's going to make the interpretation of which you say, well, it's just because they're not sure enough about things they say yes to, that they fail in consistency to make the other judgment. That's going to look like a very post hoc sort of. But I guess you might say that interpretation makes better sense if they're following what I call the participatory compromise procedure, in which we sort of say, okay, we can't hold by P, Q, R, but not Q and R. And so we ask one another, where do you feel least sure about? Okay, that might be a way, I guess, that if you follow that procedure, that might lend itself to. But the trouble with that procedure, that's only implemented in order to achieve consistency. It's not a procedure that, are you with him?
Yes, but just think of a sort of big Jeffrey individual who doesn't accept anything. He simply acts on the basis of his grievances.
Yeah.
Right? So couldn't one has comparable collective group action that sort of has grievances that come to the expression in the sort of opinions of his members, right?
Okay.
And here those grievances, and on the basis of it I act, right? In the way as a Bayesian agent acts on the
depending on its strength. So its strength will matter as much as its content.
It's a very unrealistic model, but
okay, here's an example. I read recently many of you may have done this wonderful recent stuff on how swarms of bees behave. Apparently when a beehive breaks up, it's at the end of the season, or the beginning of the season, the existing queen leaves the nest, the hive, with about half of the other bees in attendance, leaving her daughter as the queen of the old hive. And then they gather as a swarm outside the old hive, and the first thing they do is within the first hour or so they find the neighboring tree or whatever where they swarm in its branches, okay? And then they send out various bees leave this swarm, go off in different directions, and they come back, and each of them does a dance that indicates three things. One, the direction and distance of another potential place to build a hive, and thirdly, the quality of this particular location. It's an extraordinary thing. And of course, they each come back doing different dances. You know, no, over here, no. I mean, you could sort of see it like that. And through a mechanism that's not yet fully understood, they adjust to one another, right? So maybe it's, you know, if you think it's really high quality, you dance for longer, so you outdance the other guys who stopped before you while you're still dancing. They go, oh, he's still going, you know? And perhaps they then go off to go to the location where that person's still dancing, that bee's still dancing is indicated, and check it. I don't know what the mechanism is, I don't think it's known. But there is a mechanism whereby after about 2 days, and it takes 2 days, all of the messenger bees come into alignment with one another. They're all dancing the same new position. And as soon as they come into unanimity, as it were, they all move off, right? Now, sorry, I take that example. It's entertaining video, isn't it? It's a little break, but the example I like because you can imagine, you can see this swarm of bees as a sort of lower agent, right? And you can imagine, you know, it behaving in such a way that we say, well, it's pretty sure that the hive that you should go to, the new location, is over there, but it's got a certain degree of credence still that it's over there, and that's why it's still sort of wobbling. There's still some messengers coming in with deviant messages, and it seems sort of half balanced, and you sort of say, oh, its degree of credence is growing. You know, now there are fewer messengers. You know, you can, hey, it's gone high enough, it goes on, right? But the interesting thing about that story, about how a group agency is formed, is of course it's formed on the basis not of other intentional attitudes, at least we may presume not. You can imagine that the bees individually have such simple routines of behavior that it would be extravagant to ascribe to them goals or judgments or anything like that. Maybe they're so simple you could see each one of them as responding to fairly simple chemical cues, right? At least that people tell us that is not. That's one sensible way of seeing individual bee behavior. So what you're getting is a swarm, it's almost like an organism, to which, because of the complexity of its behavior, we ascribe beliefs and desires in aggregate, but we don't to the individual members. So it's a bit like the neurons in a brain, presumably don't have beliefs and desires, but the brain as a whole does, or an organism does. Now, where I see the problem, sorry, that's a long run after the wickedness that's here in Australia, but where I see the problem with your suggestion, I guess, Vladek, is that when you've got with human group agents, I think they do not form like swarms of bees. I mean, I'd love someone to give me an example where they do, and there have been suggestions that they do in something like that, and there's this Cognition in the Wild, that book by Hutchins, and various things have been suggesting. And tell me, please give me the message, because I have this problem with the notion of group agents forming in that way, that you'd have to imagine that individuals are doing things, right, that are themselves, well, a dilemma. Either they're under the individual's intentional control, right, he's doing the things he's doing, or she's doing the things she's doing, for the reason of the beliefs and the desires that they individually have, right, or not. It's not intentional behavior at all. Now, if it's not intentional behavior, then maybe you can imagine some alignment whereby the group as a whole, you know, looks like it's got beliefs and desires, but the individuals don't. But that seems sort of outlandish for human beings, because we don't in general, except when we sleepwalk or at the level of parapraxis or whatever, act in a way that escapes the whole of folk psychology. Although Tolstoy thought we did. I mean, if you think of War and Peace, he talks about the populations and the forces moving, great movements of people across the continent of Europe and so on. He pulls out into an astronomical distance and he sees it, he almost suggests that he thinks it is like that, but I don't know that anyone takes that really literally. Now if you go to the other horn of the dilemma and assume that we do individually have beliefs and desires and the way we behave, and thereby creating group behavior, it's sort of, at least I find it hard to imagine how we do that, other than having amongst the beliefs and desires we have the sort of group-oriented beliefs and desires postulated in the joint intention model. Of course, we may do it for a particular group. We might have one subgroup that judges about whether P is the case or not, another subgroup that judges whether Q is the case or not, another that judges whether R is the case or not, and then by means of sort of wiring or something, if it's yes, 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 the group is held as a whole to judge the P and Q and R. But in none of those ways it's not easy to see how you'd be ever given a base on which to ascribe degrees of belief or judgment rather than just on-off beliefs or judgments on the part of things. That's my feeling. I'd love to be proved wrong on that, actually, because it'd be very exciting. Donald Davidson once said, it's a great remark, I think it's the best remark he ever said, that you get an exciting thesis in philosophy, like groups are over and above their members or something, but the real challenge is to increase the intelligibility while maintaining the excitement. The trouble is, as you increase the intelligibility very often, the excitement drains away. It was there only because of the obscurity of the idea in the first place. But I would love to be able to maintain the excitement right into the domain of seeing how you could group agencies that exist without the individuals having beliefs and desires about what the group is doing or segments of the group are doing. Sorry, I went on much too long in response to that. I'll try to be brief.
Let me try another way of
opposing
Magnus' point here. But of course, when it comes to epistemic uses of propositions, whether we believe or not, and we can talk about degrees. But in the interpretation of the discursive dilemma, propositions of a certain nature, I mean, these are issues that you have to take a stand on that should be implemented or not.
Yeah.
And you can't really say that, okay, we implement this one to 80%. I mean, that's, in a sense, goes against the form of the So you can't really say that, okay, I want to implement P, or the group wants to implement P, we want to do Q, and we want to do Q and R, we want to do R, but we don't really want to do P, Q, and R. I mean, so the very nature of the proposition would go against a probabilistic analysis of the reasoning.
I can see a lot coming.
Well, I can
no, I don't even say
this is in support of the discussion.
But I mean, in this case, you are right. Those are issues, whole taxes. But then there are other examples of discursive dilemmas where the particular propositions are questioned. Is this the case? Is this the case? Is this the case? If all those things are the case, then we go to a certain decision. So, for example, think of decisions on tenure, right? And we then decide, well, is this candidate good on teaching? If yes. If this candidate is good on research, if yes on those, then we give him tenure, but not otherwise. So then the particular factors where they are just propositions on which we have various views and preferences and so on.
Yeah, but then the point is how you would never consider the individual, the P's and Q's. You would only consider the final conjunction of all the elements. And the discursive dilemma only occurs when you have decisions on the singular elements.
Oh yeah, but let me say, well, I don't want that. Now that sounds like an objection to me, so I'm trying to say something in response.
Sure.
Here's what I mean. Okay, so some people have said, look, Sunstein shows us a way out of the problem that I'm focusing on. So lots of people have said that to me in the past, because Sunstein argues that in political groupings in general, a very good methodology is to go for what he calls incompletely theorized agreements. What he means is, if there's an issue before you, like whether P, Q, and R, don't bother voting on P and Q and R, just vote on P and Q. Don't bother voting on P or Q or R, just vote on the compound, right? In other words, for any proposition, don't bother voting on the reason, so to speak, just vote on the issue. Incompletely theorizes as little as you have to, right? And people start suggesting, well, no, that'll get you out of the discussion straight away. My response to that has been for some time that the trouble with the group agent is that it's got to make decisions, judgments ultimately, on an issue at time t, and another issue at t plus 1, another issue at t plus 2, another issue at t plus 3. And these, so to speak, are going to be judgments, say the decision is as to whether they endorse such and such proposition as a judgment. And these are going to be maintained in the record of the entity, because it's going to be very important for other people in relating to it, that they know what it said before, because what it said before is in the way of a promise or inviting reliance or whatever. But now what's going to happen across time is that you could just as easily get the same sort of structure over time. So that's why I actually mentioned in this case, I said they vote, let's suppose, on whether to hold taxes in January, and then it's May or March when they come to whether to increase defence spending come the next election when they're in power, as they hope, and then it's June before they come to the other issue. Over time, you're going to get the problem, even if on each occasion they only vote on one issue. So I don't think that's the way out of it. For a group agent, it isn't the way out anyhow.
Different issue. But, in your model, you describe collectives as agents. You admit for collective agents, but still your model is quite individualistic in the sense that individuals come into the model with their preferences and beliefs fixed, and the collective mind is made up from those prefixed individual beliefs and preferences. But I think it's an interesting question how being a group member affects your preferences or beliefs. That there would be some kind of movement the other direction. And well, my impression is that what people might in many cases behave like the beast that you described, we adjust, that people do not have very specific judgments or preferences on most issues. We might have some very clear judgments on some issues, but on many issues we don't really know, and then we adjust to our environment. For example, when you visit a public sauna in Malmö, you listen to the people talking there, and someone has an opinion, and eventually everyone has the same opinion. Or perhaps there are two people having two different opinions, and then most people are silent until they notice in what direction the situation seems to tip over, and then suddenly everyone has their opinion. So, have you thought about whether...
That's you put your finger on a very, very rich line of thought. In this model I gave you, you're absolutely right. There's an assumption that people come to the table with their prefixed views, and then they just want to construct a view of the group, and they may find the view they've got to give to the group is something other than their own prefixed view. Right? But actually, for example, it's quite you can develop the model slightly without in any way causing a problem by saying that actually what tends to happen, as a psychological factor with many people, maybe it's a way of reducing cognitive dissonance, right? That as soon as they've constructed the views of the group, right, and realize that as group members they've got to act according to that proposition, they tend to adjust their own view, right, to come in line with the group. That could be just a psychological factor. Okay. Second observation, there might actually be very good epistemic reason for doing that, derived from Condorcet's jury theory. And again, this is, well, Loding might have something jointly on this, but he and Luke Bowman have done something really very significant on this in developing it. Condorcet's jury theory tells us that if a number of people each say have got a chance of 0.6 of being right on a given issue, then the chance of a majority being right on that issue, and they're independent, right, and their chance of being right on this, not because they all defer to the same person or something, then the chance of the majority being right on that proposition is higher than 0.6, no matter how small the group. And furthermore, the larger the group gets to be, the chance of the majority being right asymptotes towards 1. Right? And that's very easy to see why. I mean, imagine you've got a dozen coins, and you're told that each has got a 0.6 chance of coming up heads when tossed, fair toss. Now you toss the first one, it's got a 0.6 chance of coming up heads, comes up heads or tails or whatever. We all know, I mean that's part of the law of large numbers, that the more you toss, you presume that they will tend to approximate towards 60% will come up heads and 40% will, that's the limit frequency, right? But that of course shows you already that now if you take a largish group, you're going to get about 60% coming up heads. But that means that if heads means yes to a question, you're going to get a near certainty that you'll get yes to the question if each suspect has a 60% chance of saying yes to the question. So that's Condorcet's theorem. Now you might apply something like, there are various weaker versions of the theorem that are actually more plausible, more applicable, but you might think that that applies equally. So I come into a group with a view, we vote on the view, I find that, gee, most of the others go the other way. I'm happy for the group in any case to go that way, the majority rule, or whatever it is that's in operation. Maybe it's the straw vote procedure I was talking about. But not only that, but I maybe tend to adjust my own opinion rationally now, not just by way of psychological contagion, right? Third possibility is the one you sort of signal that I guess you could have the following, that people, as were simultaneously fix their own view. First model was independence between individual view and group view. Second model was interaction, psychological or rational between individual and group view. Third model is one under which you get almost like a simultaneous fixing. I mean, as if, what was it, Ian Frost who said, how can I tell what I think until I see what I say? I've got to wave in my mouth to know what it is that I believe. You might similarly have some sort of theory according to which, how can I tell what I think until I see what we say? Until I see what we, the group, think, so to speak. And maybe, trouble is, of course, that doesn't quite go with voting, because when you vote, you've got to vote on something that may not be, as it transpires, the group view. But still, you could imagine some sort of slide towards a group view on that basis. And of course, the models I've talked about don't touch that. It would be interesting to have some sort of exploration of the modeling, at the modeling level, as to how it might be done, mathematically to model it, but equally psychologically to see how far it happens.
We have time for 2 quick questions and answers.
And 2 quick answers. No, I'm sorry.
Start over here.
Sorry, my question is not short. But still, during those last 5 very interesting minutes of your speech, you used the concept of the National Assembly. Where and when was this born, this concept?
Of the nation?
Of the National Assembly. It has to do with the nation, of course.
Well, that was actually a quotation from Sieyès, in which he used the phrase National Assembly. And he used the National Assembly of the Assembly in Paris. I think that, I always get confused with the French Revolution. I think it's quite early on. It's in the, I think that quotation, yeah, it is early on, because that quotation is from an essay called Les Questions du how do you say veto in French? Veto royal, on the royal veto. And so that was before the king was executed, so it would be maybe 1790, 1791, something like that. And he's actually talking about their National Assembly. And what he wants to
short
say,
question to follow this up.
yeah,
You know about the Frankfurt Parliament in 1848.
I don't know much about it. I mean, I know a little, but very little.
Representatives for all those small city-states
Yeah.
and duchies.
Yeah.
They tried to unite Germany in a peaceful, democratic way. Is that a National Assembly or a National Parliament?
Oh, I see what you're after. Well, I don't have an answer to that myself. I guess when you talk about a parliament, you've got to already have had some sort of agreement, as it were, on procedures whereby people will be selected. Its national parliament is an assembly, but it's an assembly with a certain constitutional standing, right? Whereby expectations are presumably firm enough for legal cases to be brought about whether someone has the right to be in it or whatever it might be. Whereas with the National Assembly, you might use it more loosely for just any grouping that claims to speak on behalf of the nation. Now, actually, Sieyès does address that quite explicitly in the famous essay on the Third Estate. I think he's a much underread author. I mean, he's really very interesting on it. He's slightly, it's a wonderful moment historically of transformation, I think. But he there does ask himself the question, well, the nation, as he sees it, exists in the 40,000 parishes of France. So that's a very concrete sort of, it's a gesture, hand-waving towards the nation. And at the other extreme, he says the nation, as it were, by definition, is what the representatives speak in the name of. It's what they, in the National Assembly, speak for. So what they say is what the nation thinks. There's no sort of contingency in the relationship, no possibility of misrepresentation. But he does, of course, face the issue that anyone will face, which is, well, what about before the rules were laid down for the National Assembly, as he called it, or Convention? Who then spoke? Who can then speak for the nation? There isn't anybody, so to speak, who's been given that job, especially since he thinks that the king did not speak for the nation. And he vagues it up in, again, an Australian expression. He renders it, so to speak, strategically vague. And he basically says, well, anyone who can get enough people with him who sort of agree with him can speak for the nation. It's like, and I'll talk about this actually in the fourth lecture, I think, it's like when, you've got a group of people and someone says, what do you guys think? And, we haven't talked to someone, but someone sort of says, what we think is such and such. We demand, that the factory be closed at 5 o'clock or that we're, And where someone who speaks like that is really challenging others to deny to deny his right to speak for the group, or challenging others to say why this isn't the group view. He has puts forward a hypothesis. This is the group view. Anyone disagree, And if they don't disagree, well, it is the group view. I think that's CS's sort of picture at that stage. And you might talk about a National Assembly forming, I suppose, that isn't yet a national parliament under those circumstances.
Thank you.
This demand of conversibility that you put on group agents, I sort of wonder if you aren't a bit caught by the particularities of your favorite example, which you take from the legal system. I mean, the demands of predictability it's much greater when it comes to the rulings of the court than political decisions. So perfectly well-functioning political agents be much more sort of presentistic and they do things in the moment, they do them as a group, and it's not that important whether they connect to previous decisions or anything like that. So they could use conclusion-based voting, and that would be entirely in order.
Okay, they would quote, who was that author who said the consistency was the hobgoblin, the gremlin, of little minds. It wasn't really anything that the great figures should be worried about. That was yesterday, he says, when asked, how can you say be? He said, not be yesterday. That was yesterday, that's not today. Well, I don't know. First of all, as people, it's true, it's clearly the case for individual, natural people, that in dealing with others and inviting them, as we do implicitly or explicitly, to rely on us, we take it that we present ourselves as people who can be held to their word. So if you say you believe something, you avow belief, then you can be expected, short circumstances, genuine, you're announcing a change. It's fair enough that you should be held to this, not to blame you for not acting on it in the way they're not relying on you to act. Or if you give a promise, all the more so, that you can be held to it. In fact, Hobbes, interestingly enough, constructs the notion of a person around this. He says a person is someone who can speak for himself or for another. And I think his notion is that a person precisely is someone who can speak in the sense of can then be held to that word at later times, which I think leads into Locke's notion of a person, where Locke says the notion of a person is a forensic concept, meaning a concept around which you can assemble notions like blame or holding to account. Now, I think with natural persons, that's clearly the case. I would have said that with group agents that we think are deserving of the appellation of a legal person, a corporate person, that we hold them to very similar expectations, certainly commercial corporations, partly because, of course, they're bound by law, but also partly because the law has very long fingers in the sense that it runs well beyond the black script, so verbal agreement can even count as agreement, an informal promise from council contract, etc. But equally because these entities speak in public, in a public world, like the corporation announces its environmental policy, and then you discover that actually it's increased its level of pollution, you can hold the corporation, you could say, people can stand up and say, this corporation is deeply hypocritical, insincere, blameworthy. And no one says, oh, it's a corporation, you can't blame it for that, we hold them. But I think all the more so with government agencies.
Sure, but you could have promise keeping without, and still just conclusion-based voting. I mean, you could have promise keeping, but not bother, but why certain decisions were made.
Okay, I made one little move,
Yeah.
which is a little bit underhand, and of course what my earlier answer when I said, I think a vowel of belief is very close to promise keeping. When I tell you, I believe in P, there are of course, two ways you can hear that. One is, you asked me what I believed, and I started looking into my mind and saying, gee, that's very interesting. I never thought about that. I think I believe that P, right, as in reporting on yourself. But most of the time when we self-ascribe beliefs, it's by way of avowing the belief. We're not sort of saying, I think that's what I believe. We're saying, you can hold me to it, you know? You avow the belief, as we say. Now, I actually think that in conversation and exchange, it's the belief avowal is the default mode, so to speak. You've got to explicitly highlight the fact that I'm not to be held to this, but I think I believe so-and-so. Normally, when you're technically speaking in a vowel mode. Again, actually, that will come up in the last lecture, where I think there are different notions of the use of the we as to whether you're vowing. I'd let me not anticipate on that. But I think government agencies, in a way, we do hold to what they say. We hold the law responsible. We hold courts responsible. Of course, as you say, although notice with courts, while they themselves, they incompletely theorize. I mean, the court, for example, I gave the tort example over here, but every court in most lands will actually go by the conclusion. They'll just hold in liability. I mean, they look silly if they report their opinions, and there's evidence that judges do a lot to cover up the fact that they're in this sort of pickle. But they do just vote on the conclusion. But over time, they seek to be consistent. That's what the doctrine of, stare decisis, of precedent as avowal and so on. But similarly, I think with the legislature, obviously, it's got advisors who say, well, this is inconsistent with such and such a law, you've got to explicitly change the law. Of course, often they fail to do that, in which case the courts force them, so to speak, to be interpreted so that they come out consistent. Or agencies of government, I mean, they, after all, tribunals and so on, systems differ, but they all claim to act by the reasons, and when they give a ruling in a given case, that can be quoted in a new case. I think this is at the essence of public life with these bodies. There may be sort of in-between type bodies that are wholly presentist, but I think that presentism is a sort of is a posture that very few bodies can adopt and expect to be taken seriously or to achieve, either other members or by other outsiders.